In this video, we'll continue our exploration of the history of India by considering the Vedic period. That is, the period that comes after the fall and dispersal of the Indus Valley Civilization, whom we met earlier, and lasts until the second urbanization of India was well underway, with fewer and fewer kings ruling over larger and larger numbers of communities. The period gets its name Vedic from the fact that most of what we think we know about this time frame comes from the sacred Hindu Vedic texts. But these texts are rather limited in what they can inform us about and mostly reflect the devotional perspectives of an elite segment of just one of the major populations of India at the time. Nonetheless, the story the Vedas tell is more informative than the archaeology is about the culture and story of these Indo-Aryans. Archaeology does provide evidence, however, including small settlements that can be found in many regions of India during this period, along with various pottery types, burial types, and beyond, but we'll largely be ignoring that story in our discussion today. The scattered survivors of the Indus Valley Civilization were living in the subcontinent when the Indo-Aryans of the Vedas arrived, and there were also many groups of mostly swidden-farming hunter-gatherer types. Beyond this fact of other origin population groups for India's history, the Indo-Aryans themselves streamed into India over many hundreds of years and shouldn't be thought of as some unified group that came together and plopped themselves down in India. In exploring the history of the Vedic period, we'll mostly consider some of the insight the Vedas themselves provide, and then briefly consider some of the main archaeological types in the northwest of the subcontinent. We'll close our story a century before the end of the Vedic period, around 600 BC. I'll consider the coming, more historically accessible period in the next video. The Vedas are the longest continuously used religious texts. The language they're composed in is Vedic Sanskrit, mixed along with some loanwords from other languages picked up along the way. The influence of the Vedas on the future of India's history, where these days around 80% of the population are Hindu, can hardly be overstated. All the primary languages of North India today are descendants of Sanskrit. They stand in contrast to the four primary languages of South India, which are Dravidian in type. The Vedas themselves are divided into four, and the one that matters the most for the early Vedic period is the oldest of the Vedas, the Rig Veda. Besides the Rig Veda, there's also the Sama Veda, the Yajur Veda, and the Atharva Veda. Each Veda itself is broken down into four parts: the Samhita, Brahmana, Aranyaka, and Upanishad. Our primary concern will be with the Samhita of the Rig Veda, but first let's briefly consider the other groupings, starting with the Brahmanas. The Brahmanas are explanations of the Samhita and elaborate on the proper approaches to the sacrificial rituals. These writings are estimated to have been composed during the time period from 1200 through 600 BC. Next were the more philosophical Aranyakas and Upanishads. The Aranyakas also concern themselves with the Vedic sacrifices, but the interpretations of the Aranyakas are more symbolic and philosophical, and correspondingly reflect a slightly later tradition, and the Aranyakas are estimated to date from the expanse of time ranging from 900 through 500 BC. Finally, the Upanishads spend some time with philosophical considerations of sacrifice, and it also spends much time considering such crucial and thorny philosophical issues as the Atman, or self, and Brahman, or the whole, or ultimate reality. The Upanishads, too, are estimated to come from the 900 to 500 BC period as philosophical inquiry and creative religious ideas flourished. We'll meet two religions that arose in this time of innovative intellectual enterprise, Jainism and Buddhism, in the coming video. The most insight comes from the earliest of the Vedas, the Rig Veda. More specifically, books or mandalas 2 through 7 of the Samhita of the Rig Veda are the oldest, and their composition is often estimated to date to the period of 1500 to 1000 BC, though of course they wouldn't be written down until much later. The oldest actual writing down of the Vedas is thought to have occurred around 500 BC, and the words for writing and scribe don't appear in the Vedas. So the extent to which these early hymns retain their integrity can be debated, though in my limited exposure, it seems that historians are fairly sympathetic to the idea that these hymns have largely retained their very early forms. In defense of their being unchanged, or at least fairly so, a number of things can be pointed out. These hymns are taken by their believers as the entire cosmos in the form of sound. They have a long and ongoing tradition of exacting memorization, and their exact pronunciation and intonation were crucial for the efficacy of sacrifices. However, the traditions around prioritizing the importance of sound over meaning and of the cruciality in the efficacy of these hymns of precise pronunciation can be argued to have at least partially arisen for other reasons. It may in part mark an innovation to further monopolize access to these powerful hymns to those priests within the tradition of memorizing them, and they may as well partially arise as the effects of time increase the distance between everyday speech and the traditional language of the hymns, which makes it that the choice between sound of the word and the meaning of the word became an actual stress point in need of religious consideration. These earliest Vedas, mandalas 2 through 7 of the Rig Veda, are called the family books because they were preserved by particular clans. The earliest Vedas are interpreted to reflect a world of pastoralism of the early Indo-Aryans inflowing into and living in the northwest of Greater India as pastoral nomads. Later texts are thought to reflect them settling down more across North India. As to the extent of their pastoralism early on, while pastoral references do indeed dominate early Vedic hymns, and the importance of cattle is near impossible to overstate, agricultural references in the so-called family books do exist. They use words for sowing, a hoe, fertile fields, and furrows. That said, it's been pointed out that a number of the agricultural words found in the Vedas are loanwords, seemingly reflecting the fact that the early Vedic peoples didn't have a native agricultural framing. These cattle-valuing people of the Vedas refer to themselves as Arya and are often described as herding clans called Jana. We'll see later that this word would be combined into the term Janapada as the term for the settled communities that arose. The tradition of memorizing the sacred texts of the Vedas belonged to a priestly class, and they weren't attempting to record history, but rather record efficacious hymns to the gods. For both those reasons, the preservers and the purpose of the hymns, our vision into the history of India through these texts is very narrow. That said, these Arya have enemies, whom they call Dasa and Dasyus, and those may refer to Indus River Valley Civilization people descendants, to Adivasi, or to the descendants of earlier waves of Indo-Aryan migration. Not that those three historical supply populations of India were neatly discriminable in all instances. Also, the incorporation of both elements of Dasa and Dasyu culture and certain Dasa and Dasyu people occurred. As for Arya on Arya warfare, prayers seeking success in such ventures occur in the early Vedas. In fact, the general image conjured up by the early texts is that of a number of tribes vying with one another, finding themselves in shifting alliances, and with the two most dominant ones being the Purus and Bharatas. Some of these tribes, or at times multi-tribe groupings, were ruled by a chieftain of sorts called a Rajan. Rajans would lead their people in war, both of the defensive and offensive variety. A primary concern in early warfare appears to have been cattle capture. The black-bearded, lightning-wielding war god Indra has, among other titles, the name Gopati, or Lord of Cattle. Indra is also the most commonly mentioned god in the Rig Veda, in part reflecting the early prominence of war in the Vedic tradition, though later, as we'll see in the next video, less positive toward war attitudes grew popular. The same term that applied to Indra, Gopati, Lord of Cattle, was sometimes used for a chieftain, and the word for hero is Gojit, which means winner of cows. Cows were also the highest type of sacrifice one could offer. Another feature of the early Vedic period was the lack of the solidification of the social stratification system. While later the Varna system, called caste initially by the Portuguese and now by some others as well, would have it that Brahmanas were most superior and followed by Kshatriyas. At this point, Varna isn't used in reference to these two groups, and there's no indication that to be a Brahmana, one had to be born into it. The later Vedic texts show the Vedic clans having settled in North India, and we see the mention of large-scale gifts, and agriculture is more prominent than earlier. Villages surrounded by fields are mentioned, and corresponding to the importance of agriculture, added to the job of warrior, the Rajan was known now for protecting the settlements. There was also a rise in complexity in the economic sphere, with numerous new professions mentioned. While it's to a fair extent within the growing economic sector that some new belief types would take hold that would in part mark a rebellion against the solidifying Varna system, the later Vedic texts also mark the introduction into the Brahmanical tradition of more clear delineations of social classes through ritual hierarchy. A famous hymn from Book 10 of the Rig Veda tells the story of the creation of the universe through the sacrifice of a cosmic man, and said man's body is then broken to create reality. Some major components of reality are, quote, "From his navel, the middle realm of space arose. From his head, the sky evolved. From his feet came the earth, and the quarters of the sky from his ear," unquote. Text more pertinent to our conversation comes earlier in the hymn where, quote, "His mouth became the Brahmana, his arms were made into the Rajanya, his thighs the Vaishya, and from his feet the Shudras were born," unquote. Vedic texts also manifest vying opinions on which is the highest Varna, with the Kshatriyas, or Rajanyas here, sometimes taking the number one spot. Across the later Vedic period, the emergence of monarchical states and the general accrual of smaller communities into larger and larger political entities is shrouded in mystery. How Rajan went from chieftain to in some cases king of their Janapada is unclear as well. One suggestive myth describes the gods electing a king of the gods because without a king they couldn't face the demons in war. Eventually, by the mid-8th century BC, there were hundreds of Janapadas, and by the close of the time period under consideration, around 600 BC, there were some 16 Mahajanapadas in North India, themselves representing the consolidation of the hundreds of Janapadas which retained their now subsidiary existence. We'll follow the continuance of this consolidation in the coming video. While post-Vedic texts paint a picture of numerous cities in India having been around for a very long time during this period, the archaeology suggests an appearance of cities from shortly after 600 BC onward. Lots of evidence throughout India for smaller settlements exist, and the connections between archaeological sites with the Indo-Aryans and other groups is often debated. Likely picking up before the Indo-Aryans started their waves of migration into India, and then overlapping some with their early migration, we see the post-Indus Valley Civilization cultures in the north. From around 1900 to 1300 BC, there are the Jakar culture and the Cemetery H culture. The Jakar culture of Sindh showed traces of the Indus Valley Civilization, but lost nearly all their urban markings. Stone weights and female figurines became rare, and writing remains some, but are relegated to potsherds and no longer found on the stamp seals, which themselves went from rectangular to circular. Up north in Punjab is found the cemetery H culture, which also ran from around 1900 to 1300 BC and may well be associated with early Indo-Aryan migration into the subcontinent. While most settlements are fairly small, one settlement there, Kudwala, reached just over 31 hectares. Then, picking up around 1200 BC, also possibly of Indo-Aryan association, is the Gandhara grave culture. Picking up significantly earlier in the record, perhaps by around 2600 BC, but remaining up until just after 1200 BC, is the ochre-colored pottery culture. They lived largely agricultural lives with multiple domesticated plants and animals, the latter of which included cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, horses, and dogs. Bones of buffalo and wild deer are found as well. Associated with this culture, as well as found in other areas, is the copper hoard culture, which is the term used to describe the many hoards of copper objects found. These size variable from small to large hoards are very difficult to date and are generally fancied to be from the 2nd millennium BC. The copper objects in these hoards show a much higher rate of alloying with arsenic than the copper artifacts from the Indus civilization. Black and redware pottery is associated with a number of independent cultures from around 1450 through 500 BC. The findings range geographically as well as culturally, with finds from Neolithic, Chalcolithic, and iron-using cultures. But besides the number of distinct instances, in the western Ganges plain we find the OCP culture being succeeded by black and redware pottery, which is then followed in the area by the painted greyware culture around 1200 BC. Lastly, while iron was known for a while prior, iron had entered to some extent into the productive technologies of virtually all areas of India by 500 BC. And already by around 900 BC, iron technology usage had become fairly prevalent in some areas. In the next video, we'll take a closer look at the next time period from around 600 BC through the start of the reign of Chandragupta Maurya, before he would go on to build an empire through taking advantage of the chaotic aftermath of Alexander's invasion into northwest India.